Hello students, this is Miss Dalton and today's video is an introduction to factoring. In this unit we're going to have lots of examples of factoring and different types of factoring, but the first thing that you will always look for is you will always look for a greatest common factor. And so to look at this and find the greatest common factor, so let's look at this first example. We're going to take each term, and when I say term, a term is separated by a plus or a minus sign. So this polynomial actually has two terms. We would call this a binomial. You're going to look at every term and you're going to look for the greatest common factor that you can factor out of both of those terms. So if we look at the coefficients 15 and 9, the greatest factor that I can factor out of both of those numbers is 3. And then if you take your variables, x to the third, x squared, I want you to think about this in expanded form. So x to the third is x times x times x. X squared is x times x. We want to take the greatest number of x's that each one of them have. So each one of them has an x squared. So we're going to factor out 3x squared. And so then at that point you would write the GCF on the outside, and now we're going to go ahead and divide it out of both of those terms. So 15x to the third divided by 3x squared would be 5x. I've got that 1x left over right there. And then 9x squared divided by 3x squared would be plus 3. So your final answer should be something that when you distribute it back together, you get what you started with. And we do. This is our final answer. Look at the next one. So we have, I'm going to have to move this over a little bit. Here we go. I can see it a little bit better now. So we have in the second example 12x squared y minus 42xy to the third plus 48x to the third y. So if we look at each of our terms, we have a term here, we have a term here, and we have a term here. Again, terms are separated by a plus or minus sign. So first we want to look at our coefficients. We want to look at 12, 42, and 48. What I generally do is I look at my lowest number, so 12 for example. We're going to list out all the factors of 12, and this might help you if you're having a hard time. So we've got 1 times 12, we have 2 times 6, and then we have 3 times 4. So start with your highest number, 12. 12 cannot go into 42, so I can't use 12. Go to your next highest number, which is 6. 6 can go into 42, and 6 can go into 48. So therefore, the greatest common coefficient would be 6. So we're going to start there. Now we're going to look at our x values. So we have x squared, which is x times x. We have x, and we have x to the third, which would be x times x times x. You want to look for your common x factors. So it looks like 1x is as many as I can take out of each of the terms. And so that is what I will take out next. So we'll put an x here. And then now we want to look at our y's. So we have y. Then we have y to the third, which would be y times y times y. And then we have just y here. So again, I can only take out a single y. So that's going to go next to the 6x. So looks like my greatest common factor is 6xy. Now go ahead and divide that out of each term. So we're going to take that 6xy and we're going to divide out of each of these terms. So 12 divided by 6 is 2. If we take out one of those x's, we have an x left over, and then the y's cancel. Then we have a minus. Again, you want to keep your signs the same. 42 divided by 6 is 7. We were able to take all of the x's out, so that cancels. But then we have a y squared left over. Okay, now we're going to go to the last term, plus 48. So 48 divided by 6 is 8. X to the third divided by x is going to give me those x squareds left over. And then the y's end up canceling, and so that is what we have. Again, you want to double check when you distribute it back together. Make sure you get the original, and then if you look for the GCF using the manner that I just showed you, you won't miss anything. Okay, after you have looked for any greatest common factors, the next step is to go ahead and factor it by grouping. So we're going to use this method called grouping. So in these first few examples, I'm going to show you what it looks like when you have 4 terms, because again, that's how we want to have 4 terms so that we can group it. You can read through this, but what we're going to do is we're going to group the first 2 terms and factor out the GCF. Then we're going to group the next 2 terms and factor out the GCF. We will have gone from 4 terms to 2 terms and factor out what is common. Again, we will be doing reverse distributive properties. So let's first start here. So we're going to group our first 2 terms together. So in this example, we have x squared plus 3x plus 4x plus 12. There are 4 terms there. We're going to group our first 2 terms together by putting them in parentheses, and we're going to group our last 2 terms together by putting them in parentheses. Once we group our first 2, now we're going to look for a greatest common factor of x squared and 3x. In these 2 terms, we can factor out an x. So we're going to put the x on the outside, and now we're going to actually do that. So divide this by x and divide this by x. X squared divided by x, again, if you have to, write x times x. Look for what you can cancel. I can cancel one of those x's out, so I'm left with an x. 3x divided by x, the x's cancel, so you will have plus 3. Okay, now look at your next 2 terms, and we're going to take out our common factor of 4x and 12. Well, they don't have a variable in common, so all we need to do is look at our coefficients, 4 and 12. The greatest common factor of 4 and 12 is 4, so we're going to put a plus 4 here, and now we're going to divide both of these by that common factor of 4. 4x divided by 4 is x, and then 12 divided by 4 is 3. Now, it is no coincidence that these parentheses match. They should match, because now what we're going to do is we're going to take this whole term, x times x plus 3, and this whole term, 4 times x plus 3, and what do they have in common? Well, they have this x plus 3 in common. And they should. That is what we hope will happen. That's what should happen if you did it correct. So we're going to take out what they have in common, x plus 3, and then we're going to leave what was on the outside. But that's going to be our second parenthesis. So now we can see that our factors are x plus 3 times x plus 4. Now, if you want to check your answer, you can go ahead and use, some teachers call it FOIL, some teachers call it double distribution, but if you took x plus 3 and you multiplied it times x plus 4, Okay, well, what would you get? Well, you'd have to do x times x, which gives you x squared. Then you'd have to take x and multiply it times 4, which gives you that 4x. Then you'd take 3 times x, that gives you 3x. And then you'd do 3 times 4, which gives you 12. And you can see that this matches my original with the 4x and the 3x switched around. But again, this lets you check to make sure that you have the correct answer. Okay, if you would like, let's try this last example on your own. So go ahead and pause the video, take a few minutes to try it on your own, and then press play when you're ready to check your answers. Okay, let's check and see how you did. Now on this particular one, this is something you have not seen before, so let me point this out. When you group those first two terms together, so we've grouped 3x squared minus 12x, great. But when you group together the last two terms, you have that minus sign there, and so what I want you to do is I want you to change it to a plus sign, and then put that negative up there with the 5x. Okay, and then when you factor out your greatest common factor, right here, you're always going to factor out the negative. But if you forget to do that, then now when you divide this by negative 5, see, you will get that minus 4. If you forget and you don't factor out the negative, then this second term right here will have the wrong sign. But again, do that and it will work. Because now we have our parentheses, x minus 4, that match up. And so that's going to be your first factor. And then we're going to take the outside and write that in our second parenthesis. If you multiply this back together, you will see that it does give you the original, and so therefore this is your answer. All right, so this is just a brief introduction. Again, you should have seen factoring in Algebra 1, but this is always one of the topics that is the hardest to grasp. And so we're going to take this whole unit and just talk about factoring. So we're going to slow it down and spend some time on it. Make sure your notes are filled out. Please write down any questions that you have for me, and I will help and answer them in class.